All right, I think that we are live. If you guys can hear me, just type in the chat and say hello, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Hello, Lynn from Rhode Island, Irene from Toronto, and hello, Sue. So hey, everybody. Oh, good. See some chats coming in, so that is a good sign. Hello, and happy Webinar Wednesday to you, wherever you are coming from and joining us today. So we're really excited to be bringing you this webinar. You know, a lot of self-published authors want to know how to make their writing more poignant, more effective. And we've got Hayley with us today from ProWritingAid, and she is going to walk us through their 5 principles of creating clarity. So throughout the presentation, Hayley's been kind enough to say that she will stop and be looking at questions or trying to field them. So I'll be keeping an eye on that as well. Oh, I should have introduced myself. Hey, I'm Chelsea. So I'm Chelsea with Lulu. I am our brand engagement manager. So I will be keeping an eye on the chat. So please feel free to just drop your questions in there as we go along. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Hayley.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chelsea. I'm so excited to be here. We will go ahead and dive in. So my name is Hayley. I'm the head of learning over at ProWritingAid, which basically is the best job ever because I just get to nerd out about writing and editing all day. And before I joined the team at ProWritingAid, I worked as a teacher and curriculum developer, and I've also just done a ton in content. So I've published several books, as well as worked on just hundreds and hundreds of blog posts and other types of things. So I'm very passionate about clarity. I'm very passionate about craft, and I'm really excited to be talking about that today. Oops. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about why clarity is the most important goal for all writers. I'll also be taking you through 5 key principles to make your writing more clear. And then I'm also going to teach you how to apply those principles to your writing to make it more effective. Now, I am going to teach you how to do these how to apply these principles using ProWritingAid itself. But that being said, all of these principles are also things that you can just tackle in your own self-editing journey. So if you don't have ProWritingAid or you're not using it or anything like that, no worries. All of these principles will relate even if you don't have that tool. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So I believe that clarity is an essential part of storytelling, if not the most essential part of storytelling. And that's because if your writing isn't clear, your work will not engage readers. So as writers, our key job is to get our meaning across clearly and effectively. And if our writing is too complicated or hard to follow, then we're not doing our job. When our writing is unclear, that means our readers are going to spend more time trying to figure out what we're saying than actually engaging with our ideas. So good writing will always prioritize clearly communicating ideas over fancy, confusing language. And I like to think about this as, you know, as authors, we spend so much time thinking through our plot. We spend time thinking through our story structure, our characters, our setting. If we're writing in nonfiction, we spend time thinking through our arguments. And we really want those to shine, right? That's what we want our readers to engage with. We want them to engage with those ideas that we've spent so long daydreaming about and spent so much energy thinking about. And so our craft, our sentences are really like the vehicles to get those ideas across. And if we don't do a good job of kind of fine-tuning those sentences to make sure that those ideas really shine, then we're doing those ideas a disservice. So our goal is to make sure that our ideas can be as clear as possible so that, again, those ideas can shine through. Okay, so before we kind of get into the principles of clarity, let's talk about what I actually mean by clarity. So first, when I'm talking about clarity, I'm talking about how easy your writing is to understand. Second, I'm talking about whether or not your sentences are set up in a reader-focused way. And third, whether or not you use rich, specific language to add to your reader's understanding. Now, I want to hone in on points 2 and 3 because both include the word reader, and that's really important for clarity. Clarity is not a one-size-fits-all approach. I like to think about it more as like a sliding scale. Every one of the 70 plus of us on this webinar will have a different meaning for clarity because we all have different audiences. We all have different readers. So when you're thinking about clarity and you're thinking about applying the principles that I'm going to talk about today, the goal is to think about what clarity means for your specific set of readers. Because depending on what you're talking about and depending on who your readers are, clarity is going to be a little bit different, and we're going to apply the principles in different ways. I also want to highlight kind of the contrast between points 1 and 3. So clarity is first setting your writing up to be easy to understand, but that also means adding rich and specific language. So clarity is not just about doing the simplest thing possible, it's also making sure your language is specific enough so that your reader has more understanding based on it rather than less. And then on the flip side, clarity is not how simple or juvenile your ideas are, or whether or not your prose is unique, engaging, and exciting. Being clear actually means your prose should be more exciting and more engaging for your reader. And you can talk about very, very complex adult ideas in a clear way. And I actually think it's more important to use clear language, clear and effective language when you're talking or when you're trying to communicate complex ideas than it is when you're not. So I want you to think about clarity as starting at the sentence level. If we think about it, every sentence is almost a complete story in itself. It's kind of like a mini movie that your reader is playing in their head. So I know you can't see him right now, but my dog Knox is lying down behind me. So if I wrote the sentence, Knox lies on the couch, that sentence is a mini movie that all of you can kind of picture in your brains, even though I am not showing you Knox right now, right? So every sentence is a complete story in itself. And by making that sentence and setting it up to be clear, we're giving our readers the most engagement possible, the most information possible to engage with our ideas. So that means that, again, we have to set up our sentences in a reader-focused way and use rich, specific language to talk about what we mean. So again, if I'm looking at this photo of the castle that I have on here, I want to make sure that I'm setting up my sentence in a way that communicates exactly what the reader should be seeing. So if I just said a castle sat on a hill, that would get halfway there, but then I also need to add in that rich, specific language to talk about the fact that there are pine trees nearby or mist floating through the forest, that type of thing. And we'll dive into how to do all of that in a second. So clarity starts at the sentence level. When you have clear sentences, then you will have clear paragraphs, and then you will have clear stories. If we don't start at our sentences, then we are not going to be able to have clear stories. We really need to zoom in and laser focus in on our sentences in order to make sure our story ideas are as clear as possible. So how do we get clear sentences? I like to think about clear sentences as having 5 key principles. The first is that you make your subjects and verbs the stars of your writing. The second is that you prioritize working words over glue words. The third is to ensure your readability score is appropriate for your audience. The fourth is to choose specific and vivid words. And the fifth is to show your reader what's happening, not tell them. We're going to dive into each of these in depth. And before we get too deep in, I do just want to remind everyone, for those of you who are here or who have just joined us, each of these principles I'm going to show you, teach you about the principle, show you how to use ProWritingAid to fix it, but then I will also teach you how to fix it on your own if you do not have ProWritingAid, so don't worry. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Our first principle of clarity is to make subjects and verbs the stars of our sentences. So let's talk about what that means. When we think about subjects, our subjects and verbs are kind of the key stars that we want to focus on. Subjects are the main actors in your text, and it's important to prioritize them to make your meaning clear, to make who is in your text very clear. Verbs, on the other hand, are the action words in our story. They keep readers moving forward and engaging with the action in our story. When we prioritize subjects and verbs, we make our writing more direct, clear, and effective. So how do we do that? The first way is to eliminate passive voice. When you've written a sentence with passive voice, that means that you've put the object of your sentence before the subject of your sentence. When you do this, you take the power away from your subjects. And again, in most instances, your subject should be the stars. Here's an example of what that means. In the sample sentence we have here, the present was opened by Jane. In this sentence, Jane is the doer. She's the subject. She is the one who's performing the action, but she isn't introduced till the end. And if we think back to that kind of principle of a sentence being like a mini movie that a reader plays, if I were to read this sentence really, really slowly, the present was opened by Jane, and all of you were to picture that in your mind, you would picture kind of a present popping into focus before Jane at the end pops into focus. And that construction of the present popping in before Jane pops in is the crux of the issue with passive voice. Now, this is a really simple sentence. So in this very, very simple sentence, a passive construction is probably not going to get in the way of your reader's understanding of your meaning or who your sentence is focusing on. But as your sentences become more complicated, or if understanding the subject is important, passive voice can be dangerous because, again, it creates that kind of mismatched construction where the subject, who should be the star, is introduced at the end. So one of the things we want to focus on is reducing passive voice. The other thing that we need to do to make verbs our stars is reduce what I like to call hidden verbs. So verbs are the action words in our stories. They keep our readers moving forward and engaging with action. Sometimes as writers, we do something called nominalization, which is the process of hiding verbs. What this basically means is that you've turned a verb into a noun and added a weak verb in its place. Now, I know that sounds complicated, so let's look at some examples. Here are some examples of hiding verbs. So instead of saying analyze, which is a strong action word, saying perform an analysis is a way to hide that verb. So in that example, you've taken the strong word analyze and you've turned it into a noun, analysis, and then you've added a weaker verb in its place. This is taking away some of the power from your action words. Now, for instance, saying I'm going to make an announcement on Friday versus I'm going to announce something on Friday is a less powerful and a less strong way to say that. And again, it's not technically incorrect, but it can get in the way of your reader's understanding. And again, takes power away from one of what should be the kind of key word in your sentence, which is your verb. Now, both of these principles, both passive voice and hidden verbs, are not grammatically incorrect. So if you were to just be looking through your manuscript and working on it in Scrivener or in Google Docs or in Microsoft Word or anything like that, these will not flag as incorrect because they technically aren't. But that being said, they should be used sparingly for all of the reasons we just talked about. When you engage with either passive verbs, passive voice, or hidden verbs too often, it can get in the way of your reader's meaning. So here are some times when it's okay to use passive voice. The first time is when the subject of the sentence is unknown. So for instance, if you were writing about Stonehenge and you say, Stonehenge was built in the 10th century BC or whenever it was built. In that instance, the subject is unknown, so the subject can't be the star of your sentence. It's okay to use passive voice. You can also use passive voice if the subject of the sentence is irrelevant. So for instance, if you were saying, if you're writing a novel about the time in life building, or about Manhattan, if you were writing about Mad Men or something like that in that kind of era, you're talking about the time in life building, and you said the time in life building was constructed in 1953, and it wasn't really relevant to the rest of your sentence. In that instance, it's totally fine to use passive voice. You can also use it if you want to be deliberately vague about responsibility. So we see this often in newspaper headlines. So if something, if something was stolen, or if somebody was murdered or something like that, often newspaper headlines will set up a sentence in passive voice or a headline in passive voice to get us to want to click. This can also happen in like murder mysteries or crime novels or something like that. If you have a protagonist who discovers something on their doorstep and you say, the package was left after midnight or something like that, where you're not really sure or your protagonist doesn't know what's happening and they're not sure who to kind of give the responsibility to. In that instance, it's totally fine to use passive voice. So in any of these instances, it's okay to use it. Same thing with hidden verbs. Sometimes it's totally fine to use hidden verbs. So you can use a hidden verb if you want to be more formal or stilted in your language. So for instance, if you are writing a letter to your boss and you do want to say, I'm going to make an announcement on Friday because you think that saying I will announce this on Friday is a little too over the top. In that instance, it's totally fine to use hidden verbs to take the power away from that action verb. Similarly, if you want to define a character's voice in dialogue, so somebody who speaks that way, who is very, very formal or stilted, in that instance, it's okay to use hidden verbs. Our goal for both passive voice and hidden verbs, and honestly for all of the principles that we'll talk about today, is not to just eliminate every single example. It is, however, to figure out whether or not we're using these, using this kind of craft, setting up our sentences in this way, in a conscious way. So we're making the choice to use passive voice because it will add something. We want to make sure that we're making a choice to use hidden verbs rather than just having them kind of be a bad habit. Because when they're a bad habit, they can get in the way of our readers' understanding. But when we're using them consciously as a choice, then it can actually add to our readers' understanding. So here's how to make these edits yourself. So first, if you are worried that you've used a lot of passive voice, you can look for places where you've used the word by. So the present was opened by Jane. The word by is a good signifier that you've used passive voice. You can also look for to be plus verb constructions, which is another great, another place to add, to look for passive voice. And then once you've found those, either through to be plus verb constructions or by using the word by, you just want to swap your sentence so the subject comes first. So instead of saying the present was opened by Jane, saying Jane opens the present, fixes it and makes it in the active voice. If you're looking for hidden verbs, on the other hand, you can look for endings like ment, tion, so like make a decision. Those types of nouns tend to give away the fact that you've used a hidden verb. And then when that's happened, you can just take the noun part, so take decision, and turn that into its verb form. So decide. Makes it much easier. That being said, ProWritingAid also makes it super easy for you. So this is the ProWritingAid web editor. And within the ProWritingAid web editor, you can find instances of passive voice and hidden verbs super easily within your writing. So you can see here that these purple highlights are for passive voice, and you can hover over them and get instructions about whether it's a passive, if it's a passive verb, a passive verb, if it's a hidden verb, that type of thing. In certain instances, the tool will also offer recommendations for how to rewrite your sentences so that you can fix those errors and make it nice and easy. All right, let's talk about principle 2, which is my favorite, prioritizing working words over glue words. So we like to talk about two types of words at ProWritingAid. First are working words, and second are glue words. Working words are the words in your sentences that convey the sentence's most essential information. Glue words, on the other hand, are words that make the essential pieces of the sentence stick together. So I like to think about working words as words like your nouns, your verbs, your adjectives, that type of thing. If we take back to that sentence I gave at the beginning about my dog, Knox lies on the couch, if I switched out Knox for Hayley, the sentence would be different. If I switched out couch for bed, the sentence would be different, right? So those are working words because they contain essential information. If I swap them out, things will be very different, right? Working words, on the other hand, are the words in between. They are the ones that make the sentence make sense and stick together, but we can swap them in and out. So here are some examples of some working words. You'll notice a lot of prepositions in here, a lot of articles, that type of thing. Again, words that we can swap in and out, and our sentence will still kind of retain the same meaning. So like I just alluded to, both glue words and working words are necessary for your sentences. But if you have too many of those glue words, your sentence will start to be unnecessarily clunky and long. We recommend aiming for a glue index of around 40%. That means 40% of your sentence is glue words, those words that make the sentence stick together, and 60% are working words, words that contain the essential meaning. Now, this is kind of an average. We recommend your overall document being about 40% glue and 60% working, but within that, there's going to be some nuance, right? So some sentences might have a few more working words, some might have a few more glue words, but aiming for the average of 40% ensures that your sentences are clear and to the point. Now let's talk about what that looks like in practice. So Tell me in the chat, what are some of the working words in this sentence? This sentence has a glue percentage of 60%. So Dave walked over into the backyard of the school in order to see if there was a new bicycle that he could use in his class. What are the working words? What are the words that we cannot change or else they would change the meaning of the sentence? I'll give you a few seconds to drop them in the chat. All right, let's see. Here's what I got. The working words I got were Dave walked, backyard of the school, new bicycle, and class. These are working words because they are the words that contain the sentence's essential information. If I swapped Dave for Hayley or for Chelsea or something like that, the sentence would be totally different. And it looks like a lot of you have gotten those too. So Susan has Dave walked, backyard, school, bicycle, Dave, school, bicycle, etc. Yes, all of these, exactly. So these are our working words, again, because if we changed walked to run, or we switched Dave to anybody else, it would change. If we changed bicycle to roller skates, all of the meaning of the sentences would change. Exactly. So these are our working words. Now, the rest of the words in this sentence are glue words. Glue words, again, are words that make the sentence stick together, but we could change them to make the sentence more clear. So for instance, we could cut out the glue words in order, and we could just say, to see if there was a new bicycle that he could use in his class. We could just we could change over into to over to, and the meaning of the sentence would not change. So when it comes to fixing a sticky sentence, so noticing that you have a sentence that is sticky, that has too many glue words, what do? Well, there isn't one way to fix a sticky sentence. Sticky sentences are sentences that have too many glue words, and there is not one easy way to fix them. Every single one of us on this webinar could rewrite the sentence in a different way, and that would be fine. So let's actually try that right now. I want you to see if you can rewrite this sentence to be shorter, clearer, and to the point with fewer glue words. So I'll give you a couple seconds to do that yourself, and you can just drop it into the chat as well, and we can see all the different ways that we have shared that. So again, rewriting the sentence to try to reduce some of the glue words that we have in here. So Ronald said, Dave walked to the school's backyard for a new bicycle he could use in class. Nice. Denise says, Dave walked into the backyard of the school to see if there was a new bicycle that he could use in his class. Yeah, so we want to rewrite it. Yep. Kathy says, Kathy has Dave walked to the school's backyard to see if he could use a new bicycle in his class. Exactly. Dave walked into the school backyard to find a new bicycle to use for class. Great. Yeah. So we've got tons of different options. And that is exactly the crux of fixing sticky sentences. So there's not one way to fix a sticky sentence. There are many different ways. Here's what I came up with. Dave checked the schoolyard for a new bicycle to use in class, which brings our glue percentage down to 38. Now, all of the ways that we all fixed our sentences are totally valid. As the author, when you're fixing a sticky sentence, you have ultimate control over what you say and how you change it, which is the point of fixing sticky sentences. Now, there isn't just one way to fix it, but in order to fix it, we first kind of have to identify our sticky sentences. So I'll show you how to do this with ProWritingAid shortly, but the keys to finding sticky sentences on your own are first to look for sentences that are overly long. I would say anything that's 18 words or longer is a good indication that the sentence is too long and might have too many glue words. So 18 words or longer is a good bet that it is a sticky sentence. Now, obviously, you don't have to go through and count every single sentence to see if it's 18 words or longer, but just looking in and seeing, okay, where are places where I have I have trouble reading through this, or where I get kind of tired halfway through. It's a good indication that's a sticky sentence. Similarly, if your sentence has lots of prepositions, remember that list of glue words we looked at, prepositions were high in that list. That's a good indication that the sentence might be sticky. And similarly, conjunctions. If your sentence has a lot of clauses, it's also a good indication that it might be sticky. So when you found a sentence that's overly long, that has too many prepositions, that has a lot of conjunctions, your goal is then to look at that sentence and see how you can reframe it to be clearer and to the point. Again, there's not just one easy way to do this, but we need to identify those problematic sentences first and then fix them. Now, ProWritingAid can also help you with this. So our sticky sentences reports identifies sticky and semi-sticky sentences in your writing. Sticky sentences are sentences that you should absolutely 100% pay attention to. They're sentences with 60% glue index or higher. Semi-sticky are in that neighborhood of like 40 to 60, where you might want to look at them, but you might also just kind of want to leave them alone, depending on what, depending on your time and your editing goals. When you have a sticky sentence, you can highlight it, find the glue words, so that way you can know which words you should remove or replace in order to fix your sentence. And for everyone asking, yes, there is a recording that you guys will get later. So don't worry if you missed any of the glue words. You will get a chance to see this later. So that's our second principle, to make our sentences shorter and more to the point by removing glue words. Our third principle is to ensure that our readability score is appropriate for our audience. So inexperienced authors and often experienced authors often make their writing too difficult to read. It might sound strange, but the most effective writers make their work easier to read, not harder. Good writing always has accessible language, which makes it more engaging. And what is accessible is going to depend on who your audience is, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, most adult readers actually prefer their books to be easier to read. So if you're writing mass market fiction or you're writing for a large audience, you're typically going to want to end up at around a 7th grade readability score, which is about 12 to 13 years old. Now, that does not mean your ideas should be for 12 to 13-year-olds, but the language you use could be accessible by them. So let's talk about that a little bit more. When we're talking about readability, we're talking about 4 things. First, that our prose is clear and easy to follow. The second is that you'll use what I like to call special word chips effectively. Now, let me explain what that means. So when I used to be a teacher and a curriculum developer, I wrote a lot of assessments, often for younger students. So if I was writing an assessment for 5th graders, I would have to make sure that all of the words in that assessment, you know, led me to a 5th grade reading level, because if it was too high, they were, you know, the assessment would not be valuable for them because it would not be assessing them at an accessible level for them. So when it came to writing the wording of my questions, I had to be really careful what words I used. Now, I could use some engaging domain-specific language. So for instance, if I was writing about science, I could use the term biodiversity. But if I used that term, if I used a complicated term, I would have to make sure that all of the words surrounding that complicated term were easy enough for our readers to understand. So that's kind of the key with special word chips. It's not that you cannot use any special words. You can, you totally can, you should even, but you need to make sure that you're using them effectively. So use special word chips when they matter for your readers. So for instance, if you are writing a science fiction novel, it might make sense to use your special word chips to describe kind of interstellar travel or galactic space fighting or something like that, something to make your something that your audience will engage with, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense to do that when describing a romance scene in a science fiction novel. So again, you as the author will have the idea of what your audience will understand and will use. So you want to make sure you're using special word chips when it's effective for that audience, not just every word to show off your cool vocabulary. The other thing that readability means is that your ideas are the stars of your writing. Again, this goes all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this presentation. We want to make our ideas our stars, not our language in our sentence structure. And finally, it means that you've taken your audience's understanding into account. Now, every single one of us on this webinar have a different audience, and every single audience is going to have different understanding. Our goal here is to make sure that who our audience is reflected in our readability. So if you're writing an academic paper, your readability is going to be higher than 7th grade. If you're working on middle grade fiction, it'll probably be lower. Who your audience is determines what your readability score you should target. And you need to take into account your audience's understanding when determining that. Now, on the other hand, readability does not mean that your prose is boring or uninspired, or that you do not use any domain-specific or interesting words. You can totally play with sentence structures. You can add in those special word chips anywhere you want, but you need to make sure that you're doing it effectively and not just to show off. Prioritize clarity and accessibility over fancy confusing sentence structures. You can add, again, those layers when you want to, but make sure you're doing it consciously and not just to show off. Readability also does not mean your writing is dumbed down or your ideas are uncomplicated. So when I say that you're writing for a 7th grade reading level, that does not mean that you're writing about 7th grade ideas, unless you're truly writing for 7th graders. But you can totally talk about complex, difficult topics with more accessible language. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I actually think it's more important to use clear, easy to understand prose when you're talking about those kind of complicated ideas, so that way your meaning is not misunderstood. So how do you determine your readability? You need to look for something called your readability score. A readability score is a measure of how easy your text is to read. It measures factors like sentence length or word familiarity to predict what age group of student will be able to understand your reading, or your writing rather. There's a number of different types of tests for this, like the Flesch formulas, the Dale-Shaw, the Gunning-Fogg, all of that type of thing. They all do the same thing, which is predict what type of reader will be able to understand your text and just kind of deliver it in a different way. You can find readability calculators using most word processors. There are also tons online if you don't have one in Word or something like that, though you might run into word count limits, which can be a little bit challenging to deal with. Now, if you have run your report through a readability score and you found out that it's a little too difficult, here are some things to ask yourself. Similarly to sticky sentences, you cannot just fix a readability score or a too high readability score in one way. There are multiple ways you can do it. So here are some questions to ask yourself. First, am I using easy to understand vocabulary? Second, are my sentences short and to the point? Are you using too much jargon? Are you writing in the active voice or the passive voice? If you're using passive voice, your sentences might be a little bit more complicated. Like the example we had before, the present was opened by Jane is longer and more complicated than Jane opens the present. So it'll have a higher readability. You also want to make sure that you're not getting directly to your point and that you can trim any extra words from your sentences. So if your sentence is stuffed with glue words, it'll also be harder to read than if it's shorter and to the point. Now, ProWritingAid can also help you with readability. So we have a couple different ways that you can do this. So first of all, our real-time checker gives you an overall readability grade for your writing. You can also change it depending on the specific type of writing that you're doing. So like I mentioned before, different audiences have different goals and different levels of accessibility with readability. So for instance, I have changed this science fiction excerpt into science fiction, which shifted the goals based on what I'm looking for. So you can see that the readability grade of this sample is 10, which is outside of the target range for this style of writing. Now, within the real-time checker, which is what I'm showing you right now, you can also see specific places where you can make readability improvements to your writing by reducing or removing extra words. We also have a readability report, which highlights paragraph by paragraph which specific paragraphs you'll need to change. So for instance, this one highlights my difficult to read paragraphs, so I know where to spend my time in order to effectively edit this manuscript. Okay, let's move on to principle 4. So our fourth principle of clarity is to choose specific and vivid words. So we've talked a lot about cutting words out and making our sentences clearer and to the point, but we also need to make sure that the words that we do choose to include are specific enough to get our point across. So vague words lack the clarity our readers want. For instance, if you describe your protagonist as a tall girl, that kind of means nothing because tall is subjective. Tall means something completely different to a short person than it does to a tall person. So you'll need to be more specific to paint a clear picture for your reader. Words like more or good or excellent, some, large, better, all of these are ambiguous. What I view as excellent might be very different from everyone else on this presentation. So we need to choose more specific words to make our writing more effective. Here's an example. So in the sentence, Kate made some improvements to her cabin and now it's worth more. The sentence is totally vague, right? Every single one of us, this sentence probably means something different too. So for me, I live alone and I've never been a homeowner. So making some improvements to a cabin for me is just like putting the dishes away and like maybe if you're getting fancy, adding some plants outside, right? So that's some improvements to me. On the other hand, my mom is an architect and has worked on dozens of design projects. So for her, making some improvements means you've completely renovated the bathroom and added a new kitchen, right? So the sentence is way too open to interpretation. A better way to say this is to be more specific. So saying Kate replaced the bathroom suite, repainted the living room, and laid hardwood floors in her cabin. As a result, its value has increased by 10%. This second example is much more specific. We know exactly what Kate did to make her cabin worth more. We also know what worth more means to Kate, right? It means that the overall cabin value has increased by 10%. Now, clarity does not always equal brevity. If we go back to these two different examples, this second example is much more specific, right? It's much longer and it's much more specific. So when we're trying to be clear, we're not always trying to be brief. What we are trying to do is choose words that matter, right? So if we look at this sentence and we think back to our idea of sticky sentences and glue words, this sentence does not have very many glue words, right? Because most of the sentence words are working words. If I changed bathroom suite to kitchen suite, the sentence would be different. If I changed living room to kitchen, the sentence would be different. So most of the words in here are working words, which is the key. We want to make sure that we're choosing specific words and using them as working words to make our sentences make sense. All right. So the best way to be more specific is to ask yourself, is the movie a reader playing in their head accurate to what I'm trying to show? So if someone just took your sentence or your paragraph in a vacuum, would they be able to accurately depict what you are trying to show? Again, this is not an easy thing to do when self-editing by yourself, but you need to ask yourself that question of, would this movie be accurate? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. But before we get there, I just want to show you what ProWritingAid can do to help you with that. So our diction report will find places where you've used vague and abstract words and identify them so that you can easily replace them with words that would be more clear. Because again, a lot of us cannot make these edits ourselves, or again, you can use kind of the camera test to understand, but using ProWritingAid can make it much faster and more effective. So that kind of leads us into our fifth principle, our fifth and final principle, which is to show your reader what's happening, not telling them. So telling emotions rather than showing them is a common mistake, especially for newer authors. Many inexperienced writers will tell their readers about a character's emotions instead of using language to describe them. While there certainly will be points in your text where telling makes more sense, showing should be your primary goal as a writer. You want to create a vivid picture in your reader's mind that will engross them in your writing. So here's an example of telling. When Mary saw her test grade, she was embarrassed. In this example, we have told our reader that Mary feels embarrassed and that she has a bad test grade. On the other hand, you could write it as, when Mary saw the big red F on her work, her cheeks flushed red. She crumpled the test and hid it in her desk, hoping no one noticed. In this example, if we think back to the camera test that we just talked about, we have a much clearer understanding of what Mary is doing. If this were to become a movie, the director would have so many notes of how to kind of set up the scene and of what the actress who plays Mary should do to make the scene, to make Mary's emotions clear, right? So we can picture as readers the big red F on her test. We can picture her cheeks flushing. We can picture her movements. In this example, we haven't just kind of told the reader what's happening. We're actually showing them through the language and the description. Showing rather than telling creates more engagement for our readers. When you tell your readers everything your characters are thinking and feeling, you're taking nuance away from their interpretation of your work. Showing, on the other hand, allows your readers to draw clear conclusions about your characters. But in order for those conclusions to be correct, of course, you need to make sure that you're using specific language, which we talked about previously. While all writing will require some showing, or require some telling rather, showing lets your readers form that deeper relationship that will let them interpret the clues you've left so that they're more invested in your work. So here's an example. Tell land is a peaceful kingdom with happy, prosperous citizens. The king is beloved by his people, and both rich and poor live in harmony. Could a camera understand what Tell Land looks like? Not really. The camera would need much more information. We couldn't tell if it was a seaside kingdom or if it was a kingdom in the mountains like we talked about previously. So in this example, the goal would be to, again, give information through the description so people can understand what's happening. Now, ProWritingAid can also, that camera test is the clear way to help you with that. ProWritingAid can also help you with this. So our real-time checker, depending on what you have identified as your document type, will identify places where you have told emotions rather than showed them. Here in this instance, we can see that we're within the range for the specific text. Another report I love for this is the sensory report, which sees how many different sensory words you've used. So we can see that we have 62% sight, 31% sound, and 8% touch. So that means we're totally ignoring smell words. And so we're ignoring 2 out of the 5 sentences. And then we're also really heavily skewed for sight. So this can help us, again, add in those kind of sensory details to make sure we're giving a clear understanding of our text for our reader. Okay, so Irene asked, can you use pictures to show? You totally can, especially if you're writing kids lit or for younger audiences, but you still want to make sure that you're showing as much as possible. Now, in a kid's novel or a kid's book, saying, Irene is sad or something like that, if you're writing for a very young audience, will make sense. But as your audience gets older and as your target demographic gets older, again, you'll want to add more showing rather than telling into that. So that kind of goes back to what I was talking about the sliding scale of clarity. Our goal is to figure out what's clear for our specific set of readers. Okay, so today we talked all about what clarity means for your readers and why clarity is so important, as well as 5 different ways to improve the clarity of your writing, both by yourself and using ProWritingAid. If any of you are interested in trying ProWritingAid, I have a 40% discount coupon that I'm just going to drop in the chat that you can test out, and I'll also share it with Chelsea so she can email it out to attendees later. And yeah, we would be happy to have you join us. We also do a 1-week free trial if you'd like to try it out for free, but this discount code is available through Friday. So let me just check in on the chat. There were a couple questions that came in. So Tom says, ProWritingAid sounds good. Does it work well with nonfiction? Totally, Tom, it definitely does. So let me show you one of my nonfiction samples. So just the way we can kind of set our samples for different types of fiction writing, we can also do this for nonfiction. So I can switch my goal over here to be a ton of different types of academic or business writing as well, and then it'll give different recommendations for that. Ronald says, is there a way to assess the sellability of a book title? Not specifically within ProWritingAid, but I think there are probably some marketing software that can really help you with that. And yes, Kathy, there will be a recording later too.
Hey, Hayley, for those who kind of joined late or maybe missed the beginning, can you just give us an overview of what ProWritingAid is and what your strengths are and what the user can be looking for and what they can find with ProWritingAid?
Yeah, totally. ProWritingAid is an editing software. So I like to think about it as a grammar checker with superpowers. You have a bunch of different reports. You have more than 20 different reports kind of at your disposal to edit your text. So what I have right now is our real-time checker, which gives you feedback on your writing in real time in relationship to grammar, style, and spelling errors. And then you also have 20 plus other reports that can get you into deeper areas. So for instance, you can go in and look at places where you have used echoes in your text. So places where you've used the same phrases over and over again, which is something I am really guilty of. You can also look at your sentence length. You can look at your overall readability, your sticky sentences, your diction, and other things that we talked about before too. We have a number of different integrations. So I'm using our web editor right now. We also have a Chrome extension, a Google Docs add-on, a desktop app that lets you work with tools like Scrivener, as well as a Microsoft Word add-in too. So Tom says, can ProWritingAid handle long documents over, for instance, 500 pages? So you can upload chapter by chapter, which is totally fine. I typically recommend people only edit one chapter at a time because first of all, it'll take a long time for the reports to run. But second of all, I don't think that anyone should be editing 500 pages in one sitting. So think about however, if you're going to edit 30 or 50 pages in one sitting, and that would be totally fine. Okay, let's see. Humor is important in my writing. How does ProWritingAid work for that? So it's definitely not programmed to recognize humor. I wish it was. That would be great. But it can help you, again, figure out if you're setting up your humorous sentences clearly and making sure that you're using, cliches and stuff like that in an effective way. Alex says, what sort of online teaching tools are available to ProWritingAid users? Yeah, so we have tons of different tools that are available. So one of them are videos. So we have, if you pop this little eye, every single one of the suggestions comes with an article that explains why we're making that suggestion. And then they also have videos within them to teach about that as well. Okay. Why is there a monthly fee? So Lou, there's a monthly fee, but you can also do a lifetime fee as well. So you can choose a lifetime annual a monthly, annual, or lifetime fee. It's totally up to you. So if you want to play a one-time purchase, you can purchase the lifetime version. John asks, does it work on the Chromebook? Yes, our web editor will work on the Chromebook.
I saw there's another question from Chris, and he's amazed by how some writers can use metaphors and appealing turns of phrase, something unexpected to achieve a charming clarity. Any advice on how to accomplish that? My advice, which is maybe unsolicited since Hayley, but I don't think there's an easy answer for that. My advice would be keep reading. I think reading and digesting how authors are doing that and the way that they're employing those techniques is maybe the best way to learn how to do it in an effective way. I don't know, Hayley, if you have any secrets that you can share with us on that.
Yeah, no, I don't have any secrets, but I will say that I think the best thing is to try to be authentic to your own voice. And so if you are good at doing those kind of appealing turns of phrase, then great. But if you're not, then that's also okay. So understanding how to read and reading and seeing what other authors do is great, but also you can kind of develop your own unique authorial voice, and that's totally fine as well.
Awesome. So we've only got a couple minutes left here. So I just want to open it up for questions one more time and see if there's anything else we can address for you fine folks who have joined us today, whether it's morning, afternoon, or night, wherever you are. So we'll give that a couple more seconds. Hayley, is there anything else for people who aren't familiar with ProWritingAid, anything they need to know, or coming to the ProWritingAid website, anything they need to have kind of prepared? What stage of your manuscript should you be in when you start working with ProWritingAid?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would totally recommend coming at almost any stage. I use it for blog posts as I finish an individual blog post. Sometimes people really like to use it during the writing process itself. I tend to like it to use it at the end. So for me, I like to use at the end when I'm ready to edit, I turn off the real-time checker until I'm in that stage, whereas some people like to get feedback kind of as they go. So it's really like a multiple option. There's multiple options here for you. And so you can kind of figure out which system works for you. This can work on anything from like Facebook posts to your entire manuscript. So our Chrome extension makes it really easy to do kind of editing in all places, which is really nice. So you don't need to have a full manuscript to use it by any means. You could totally have just, I want to check my emails or I want to check my Facebook posts, or both that and finishing your manuscript as well.
Oh, perfect. If your Facebook posts are getting too convoluted and you're not getting enough likes, or ProWritingAid can help you out there.
Exactly.
Well, before we head out and wrap up, Sri put, check out I Never Met a 4 I Didn't Like, and that is a book recommendation. And I love it. Funny title I'm a fan of. So thank you guys all for joining us today. I appreciate everyone who took the time to check in with us and listen. And hopefully you all learned new things. So there will be a recording of this available. Everyone who is in this webinar or signed up for it, you will receive a recording once we are done here. And thank you again. So if there are any other questions that kind of trickle in, I will send them Hayley's way. So we'll make sure we get all of those answered. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful Wednesday. And Hayley, thank you. And thank ProWritingAid so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.